The crack of a gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Fort Smith, Arkansas, in the late spring of 1877. But Grace Lawson barely registered the sound until she felt strong hands shoving her roughly to the ground. Her shopping basket went flying, scattering apples across the dirt road as her body hit the earth with a painful thud. Before she could gather her wits, a sickening grunt sounded above her, followed by the heavy weight of a man collapsing half across her skirts. Mr. Blackwell. She gasped, recognizing the tall cowboy who had knocked her down. His face had gone ashen, and crimson blood was rapidly spreading across the blue cotton of his shirt. In that terrible moment, Grace realized what had happened. He had taken a bullet meant for her. People were shouting all around them now. The gunman was being wrestled to the ground by the blacksmith and the sheriff's deputy, but Grace's attention remained fixed on the man bleeding onto her skirts. Garrett Lockhart was his proper name, though most in town just called him that Blackwell Cowboy after the ranch where he worked. "Someone fetch the doctor," Grace cried, pressing her hands against the wound in his shoulder. Blood seeped warm between her fingers. "Hurry!" Garrett's eyes fluttered open, meeting hers with startling clarity despite his pain. "Are you hurt, Miss Lawson?" he asked, his voice strained but steady. "No, I'm fine," she assured him, amazed that his concern was for her when he was the one bleeding. "Why would you do such a foolish thing?" A ghost of a smile crossed his pale lips. "Didn't seem foolish at the time, madam." The town doctor arrived moments later, and with the help of several men, they carried Garrett to the physician's office just down the street. Grace followed, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and confusion. She barely knew Garrett Lockhart. He was just a quiet cowboy who tipped his hat to her when they passed on the street, who occasionally ordered coffee at her father's general store. And now he had risked his life for hers. "The bullet's lodged deep," Dr. Matthews announced after his examination. "I need to operate immediately." He turned to Grace, who stood trembling in the corner of the examination room. "Miss Lawson, perhaps you should go home and change. Your father will be worried." Grace looked down at her blood-stained dress and shook her head. "I'll stay," she said firmly. "This man saved my life. The least I can do is wait to hear if he'll be all right." The doctor sighed but nodded. "Very well, but wait outside, please." Grace paced the small waiting area for nearly 2 hours while the doctor worked. Her mind raced with questions. Why had someone shot at her? And why had Garrett Lockhart, a man she barely knew, risked his life to save hers? Sheriff Boyd arrived while she waited, his expression grim beneath his thick mustache. "Miss Lawson, we've got the shooter in custody. Name's Emmett Walsh. Says he was aiming for you." Grace's hand flew to her throat. "For me? But why?" "Claims your father cheated him on a land deal last year, lost his farm because of it, been drinking and festering on it ever since." The sheriff shook his head. "Damn fool. Your father's the most honest merchant in 3 counties. "My father would never cheat anyone," Grace said, though her voice trembled. The thought that someone had wanted to kill her made her feel suddenly cold despite the warm spring day. "Everyone knows that," Sheriff Boyd assured her. "Walsh will hang for attempted murder, make no mistake." He glanced toward the door where the doctor was still working. "How's Lockhart?" "I don't know yet," Grace admitted, wringing her hands. "The doctor's still with him." As if summoned by their conversation, the door opened and Dr. Matthews emerged, wiping his bloody hands on a towel. His face was drawn with fatigue. "Well," Grace asked anxiously. "I got the bullet out," the doctor said, "but he's lost a lot of blood. The next 3 days will tell the tale if infection sets in." He let the sentence hang unfinished. "Can I see him?" Grace asked. The doctor hesitated, then nodded. "Briefly. He's unconscious, but sometimes familiar voices help." Grace wasn't sure why the doctor thought her voice would be familiar to Garrett, but she didn't argue. She entered the small room where Garrett lay still as death on the examination table, his shoulder heavily bandaged, his bronzed face unnaturally pale. "Mr. Lockhart," she whispered, drawing closer. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I want to thank you for what you did." It was incredibly brave. She thought she saw his eyelids flutter, but he remained unconscious. Up close, she studied his face, the strong jaw covered in a day's worth of stubble, the straight nose, the dark lashes that now lay still against his cheeks. He was handsome in a rugged way and younger than she had realized, probably only a few years older than her own 22 years. The doctor cleared his throat behind her. "He needs rest now. You should go home and change, Miss Lawson. Tell your father what happened." Grace nodded and reluctantly left Garrett's side. She stepped out into the late afternoon sunlight, feeling somehow changed by the day's events. A man she barely knew had taken a bullet meant for her. The least she could do was make sure he recovered. When she reached her father's general store, George Lawson was beside himself with worry. Word had spread through town about the shooting, and he had been about to come looking for her. "Grace," he exclaimed, pulling her into a tight embrace before holding her at arm's length to examine her blood-stained dress with horror. "Are you hurt?" "No, Papa, it's not my blood. It belongs to the man who saved me, Garrett Lockhart." Her father's brow furrowed. "Lockhart? The cowboy who works for Blackwell?" "Yes. He pushed me out of the way and took the bullet himself." Even saying the words aloud didn't make them seem more real. "Sheriff Boyd says the shooter was a man named Walsh who blamed you for a bad land deal." Her father's face darkened. "Emmett Walsh. That fool refused to read the contract before signing it. I warned him the land was prone to flooding, but he wouldn't listen. Then blamed me when the spring floods washed out his crops." He shook his head. "To think he'd try to hurt you because of it." "Mr. Lockhart is in a bad way," Grace said softly. "Dr. Matthews says the next 3 days will determine if he lives or dies." Her father's expression softened. "Then we must do what we can for him. He has no family here, does he?" "I don't think so. He's only been working at the Blackwell Ranch for about 6 months. Then he'll need someone to look after him." George Lawson nodded decisively. "Go change your clothes, Grace. Then you can take some supplies to Dr. Matthews, food, clean bandages, whatever else he needs." "Yes, Papa." Grace hesitated. I think I'd like to help tend to Mr. Lockhart if Dr. Matthews allows it. He saved my life after all." Her father studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Of course. It's the Christian thing to do." Grace hurried upstairs to change, her mind already planning what she would need to bring to the doctor's office. She wasn't a trained nurse, but she had helped care for her mother during her long illness 3 years ago. She knew how to change bandages, how to coax broth into a patient, how to keep a cool cloth on a fevered brow. What she didn't understand was why her heart was racing at the thought of seeing Garrett Lockhart again, or why she felt such an overwhelming need to be the one to help him recover. She barely knew the man, and yet, as she changed into a fresh dress, she couldn't stop thinking about those few seconds when his eyes had met hers, even as his blood soaked her skirts. "Are you hurt, Miss Lawson?" he had asked, thinking of her safety even as he bled. By the time Grace returned to the doctor's office an hour later, carrying a basket of supplies, Garrett's condition had worsened. A fever had set in, and he tossed restlessly on the narrow bed where they had moved him, occasionally muttering incomprehensible words. "This is not a good sign so soon," Dr. Matthews said grimly as he accepted the fresh bandages Grace had brought. "The wound may already be infected." "What can I do to help?" Grace asked, setting her basket on a small table. The doctor regarded her thoughtfully. Miss Lawson, this is likely to be a long vigil. You should go home and rest. I can send word if there's any change." "No," Grace said firmly. "I want to stay. Please, Dr. Matthews, I nursed my mother for months before she passed. I know how to care for the sick." After a moment's hesitation, the doctor nodded. "Very well. Keep cool." Compresses on his forehead. "Try to get some water into him when he's lucid enough to swallow. And call me immediately if the fever spikes higher or if the wound begins to seep through the bandages." Grace settled into a chair beside Garrett's bed, determined to see him through this crisis. As the doctor left to attend to other patients, promising to return in a few hours, she dipped a cloth into cool water and gently placed it on Garrett's forehead. His eyelids fluttered at the contact, and for a moment his gaze focused on her face. "Miss Lawson," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Yes, Mr. Lockhart, I'm here." She leaned closer so he could see her clearly. "How are you feeling?" A weak smile touched his lips. "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo." His eyes clouded with confusion. "Why are you here?" "You saved my life today," she reminded him gently. "The least I can do is help you recover." He seemed about to say something more, but his eyes drifted shut again, the fever pulling him back into unconsciousness. Grace continued to bathe his face with the cool cloth, studying his features as she worked. In repose, despite the flush of fever, there was something compelling about him, a quiet strength, a dignity she hadn't noticed before. As night fell, Dr. Matthews returned to check on his patient. "The fever hasn't broken," he noted with a frown after examining Garrett. "This will be a critical night. You should go home, Miss Lawson, get some rest." But Grace shook her head. "I'll stay. My father knows where I am." The doctor looked as though he might argue, but instead he sighed. "Very well. There's a cot in the next room if you need to lie down. I'll be upstairs if his condition changes." Left alone with Garrett, Grace continued her patient ministrations. Throughout that long night, she bathed his face and chest with cool water, trying to bring down the fever. When he thrashed and muttered in delirium, she spoke soothingly to him, though she doubted he could hear her. Sometimes in his fever dreams, he called out names she didn't recognize: Sarah, Pa, Jimmy. Once, he seemed to be reliving some terrible event, begging someone to hold on and don't die. During these moments, Grace held his hand and assured him that everything was all right, that he was safe. As dawn broke, Garrett's fever finally began to subside. His breathing grew more regular, and he fell into what seemed to be natural sleep rather than fever-induced unconsciousness. Grace, exhausted from her night's vigil, allowed herself to close her eyes for just a moment. She awoke to the sensation of being watched. Opening her eyes, she found Garrett looking at her, his gaze clear and alert despite the pain and exhaustion evident in his face. "You're still here," he said softly. Grace straightened in her chair, embarrassed to have been caught sleeping. "Yes, how are you feeling?" "Better, I think." He tried to shift position and winced, though I wouldn't recommend getting shot as a pastime. Despite herself, Grace smiled. "I'll keep that in mind." She reached for the water glass on the bedside table. "Are you thirsty? Parched?" She helped him raise his head enough to drink, acutely aware of the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers, the way his eyes never left her face. When he had drunk his fill, she eased him back against the pillows. "Why did you do it?" she asked suddenly. "Take that bullet for me." Garrett was quiet for a long moment. "I saw Walsh pull the gun, saw him aiming at you, didn't really think about it, just moved." He met her gaze directly. "I'd do it again." "But why? You barely know me." A faint smile touched his lips. "I know enough, Miss Lawson." Before she could ask what he meant, Dr. Matthews entered the room, pleased to find his patient awake and alert. "The fever's broken," the doctor confirmed after examining Garrett. "That's a good sign. But you're not out of danger yet, Mr. Lockhart. That wound could still turn septic. "How long before I can get back to work?" Garrett asked. Dr. Matthews shook his head. "Not for several weeks at least, and even then your arm won't be much use for a while longer. You'll need someone to look after you during your recovery." Grace spoke up immediately. "He can recover at our home. We have a spare room and I can tend to him." Both men looked at her in surprise. "Miss Lawson, that's very generous, Doctor." Matthews began, "But it wouldn't be proper. My father will be there," Grace interrupted. "And Mr. Lockhart saved my life. Surely the town gossips can understand our desire to help him recover." The doctor still looked doubtful, but Garrett's expression had softened. "I appreciate the offer, Miss Lawson, but I can't impose on your family like that." "It's not an imposition," Grace insisted. "It's the least we can do." She turned to the doctor. "When can he be moved?" Recognizing her determination, Dr. Matthews sighed. "If he continues to improve, perhaps tomorrow afternoon. But he'll need to be transported very carefully." "I'll have my father arrange it," Grace said with a decisive nod. After the doctor left, Garrett regarded her with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "Why are you doing this, Miss Lawson?" Grace considered the question. Why was she so determined to care for this man? Was it simply gratitude for his heroic act? Or was there something more, something about the way his eyes held hers, the way his first concern had been for her safety even as he bled? "Because you risked your life for mine," she said finally. "And because I believe that when someone shows such extraordinary kindness, it should be repaid in kind." Garrett studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you." Grace stayed by his side for the remainder of that day, leaving only briefly to inform her father of the plan and to prepare the spare room in their home above the general store. George Lawson had readily agreed to the arrangement, expressing his own gratitude toward the young cowboy who had saved his daughter's life. By the second night of her vigil, Garrett was stronger but still battling occasional bouts of fever. During one such episode, as Grace bathed his face with cool water, he caught her hand in his. "Sarah," he murmured, his eyes unfocused. "No, Mr. Lockhart, it's Grace Lawson." His gaze cleared slightly. "Miss Lawson, I'm sorry." He released her hand. "You reminded me of someone for a moment." "Who is Sarah?" Grace asked gently. Pain flickered across his face that had nothing to do with his physical wound. "My sister. She died 3 years ago, consumption." "I'm sorry," Grace said softly. "I lost my mother to the same disease." His eyes met hers, and in that moment a connection formed between them, a recognition of shared grief. "It's a terrible way to go," he said quietly. "Yes, it is." Grace hesitated, then asked, "Do you have other family?" Garrett shook his head slightly. "Not anymore. My pa died in the war when I was 14. Ma struggled on for a few years, but her heart gave out not long after Sarah passed. My brother Jimmy was killed in a mining accident last year." A sad smile touched his lips. "Just me now." Grace's heart ached for him. "No wonder you came all the way to Arkansas." "Needed a fresh start," he agreed. "Blackwell's a good man to work for, treats his hands fair." "And has he been informed about what happened?" Dr. Matthews sent word. "Got a message back saying my job will be waiting when I'm healed up." Garrett shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at his wound. "Though I don't know how much use I'll be to him one-armed." "Dr. Matthews said you'd regain use of your arm eventually," Grace reminded him. "You just need time to heal. Time I can spare, money not so much." He sighed. "Been saving to buy a small spread of my own someday." "Well, you needn't worry about expenses during your recovery," Grace assured him. "My father insists on covering your medical costs." Garrett's expression hardened. "I don't accept charity, Miss Lawson." "It's not charity, Mr. Lockhart. It's gratitude. There's a difference." They regarded each other stubbornly for a moment before Garrett's lips quirked into a reluctant smile. "You're a determined woman, aren't you? So I've been told." Grace returned his smile, usually not as a compliment. It was meant as one. The simple statement warmed her more than it should have. As the night deepened around them, they continued to talk quietly. Garrett told her about growing up in Tennessee, about his dreams of having his own ranch someday. Grace shared stories of her childhood in Fort Smith, of helping her father in the store after her mother died, of her own dreams of someday traveling to places she'd only read about in books. When Garrett finally drifted off to sleep in the early hours of the morning, Grace realized with surprise how easily conversation had flowed between them, how comfortable she felt in his presence, despite having known him properly for just 2 days. There was something about Garrett Lockhart that drew her to him, a quiet strength, an innate gentleness that belied his rugged exterior. On the third day, as promised, Dr. Matthews declared Garrett well enough to be moved to the Lawson home. The transfer was accomplished with the help of several men from town, including the blacksmith and one of Garrett's fellow cowboys from the Blackwell Ranch, who had come to check on him. The spare room in the Lawson home was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that overlooked the main street of Fort Smith. Grace had spent the morning preparing it, airing out the room and putting fresh linens on the bed. "This is mighty fine, Miss Lawson," Garrett said once he was settled, his voice betraying his exhaustion from the short journey. "I don't know how to thank you and your father properly." "You can thank us by concentrating on getting well," George Lawson said from the doorway. The store owner had taken an immediate liking to the young man who had saved his daughter's life. "Grace will bring you up some broth shortly. Dr. Matthews says you need to build your strength." After her father left, Grace lingered, adjusting the pillows behind Garrett's head. "Are you comfortable? Do you need anything else?" "Just for you to stop fussing," Garrett said, though his smile took any sting from the words. "You look exhausted, Miss Lawson. When was the last time you slept properly?" Grace realized with surprise that it had been 3 days since she had slept in her own bed. Between her vigils at the doctor's office and preparing for Garrett's arrival, she had managed only brief naps in uncomfortable chairs. "I'm fine," she insisted, though even as she spoke, a yawn escaped her. Garrett raised an eyebrow. "Go rest, Miss Lawson." "I promise not to die while you're sleeping." The blunt words made her flinch. "Don't say such things, even in jest." His expression softened. "I'm sorry, but I mean it. You need to rest. You've done more than enough for me already." Reluctantly, Grace agreed to lie down after bringing him some broth. But even as she finally crawled into her own bed that afternoon, her mind kept returning to the man in the spare room, to his quiet strength, to the sadness that sometimes shadowed his eyes when he spoke of his lost family, to the way her heart had begun to race whenever he smiled at her. It was ridiculous, of course. She barely knew Garrett Lockhart, and yet, after spending 3 days at his bedside watching over him, learning about his life, she felt as though she had known him much longer. Over the next 2 weeks, as Garrett slowly regained his strength, Grace found herself looking forward to their conversations more than anything else in her day. Between helping her father in the store and tending to Garrett's needs, she was busier than ever, but she never seemed to tire of his company. For his part, Garrett proved to be a surprisingly good patient, uncomplaining about his discomfort, grateful for the care shown to him, and genuinely interested in the small details of Grace's life that she shared during their conversations. "You have a real gift for storytelling," he told her one evening as she described the antics of Mrs. Peterson's escaped chickens that had caused chaos in the store that day. "You make even the most ordinary things sound interesting." Grace felt herself blush at the compliment. "It's just life in a small town. Nothing compared to your adventures driving cattle or breaking wild horses." "I don't know about that," Garrett said thoughtfully. "Sometimes I think there's more adventure in finding joy in the everyday than in all my wandering." It was these moments, when he revealed a depth of thought that surprised her, that Grace found herself most drawn to him. Behind the rugged exterior of the cowboy was a thoughtful man with dreams and regrets, hopes and fears. As Garrett's recovery progressed, Dr. Matthews began having him perform exercises to strengthen his injured shoulder. The work was painful, and Grace often found Garrett gritting his teeth as he slowly raised and lowered his arm according to the doctor's instructions. "You don't have to watch this," Garrett told her during a particularly difficult session, sweat beading on his forehead as he struggled to extend his arm. "Must be about as entertaining as watching paint dry." "I'm not here to be entertained," Grace replied simply. "I'm here to encourage you." "Well, you do that just by being in the room," Garrett said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Such moments were becoming more frequent between them, moments when the air seemed to hum with unspoken feelings, when their eyes would meet and hold for a heartbeat too long to be merely friendly. By the end of the third week, Garrett was able to move about the house unassisted, though his arm remained in a sling most of the time. Dr. Matthews pronounced himself satisfied with the healing of the wound, though he cautioned that full recovery would take months rather than weeks. "You're a lucky man, Mr. Lockhart," the doctor said during one visit. "An inch to the left and that bullet would have pierced your heart." "I consider myself lucky for many reasons, Doctor," Garrett replied, his gaze shifting briefly to Grace. That evening, as Grace brought Garrett his dinner tray, she found him standing by the window, looking out at the sunset that painted the town in shades of gold and crimson. "You should be resting," she chided gently, setting the tray on the small table beside the bed. "Been resting for 3 weeks," Garrett said without turning. "A man can only lie still for so long before he starts to feel like he's growing roots." Grace moved to stand beside him, following his gaze to the western sky. "It's beautiful tonight." "Yes, it is." But when she glanced up at him, she found he wasn't looking at the sunset at all. His eyes were on her face, his expression soft with an emotion she was afraid to name. "Garrett," she said, using his given name for the first time. "I, Miss Lawson," he interrupted gently. "Grace." "There's something I need to say to you." Her heart began to race. "Yes, these past few weeks, getting to know you." He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I've never met anyone like you. Your kindness, your strength, the way you see the world, it's all remarkable to me." Grace felt a warmth spreading through her chest. "I feel the same way about you," she admitted softly. Garrett's good hand came up to touch her cheek, his fingers calloused but gentle against her skin. "I have nothing to offer you. I'm just a cowboy with a bum arm and big dreams." "You offered me my life," Grace reminded him, leaning slightly into his touch. "And I think your dreams are wonderful." For a long moment they stood there, suspended in time as the last rays of sunlight streamed through the window. Then, slowly, Garrett lowered his head and brushed his lips against hers, a kiss so gentle it was barely more than a whisper. Yet it sent Grace's heart soaring. When he pulled back, his eyes searching hers for a reaction, Grace smiled and reached up to touch his face in return. "I think I've been waiting for you to do that since the second day of your fever, when you started making sense again." A slow smile spread across Garrett's face. "If I'd known that, I might have recovered faster." Grace laughed, the sound bright and happy in the quiet room. "Your dinner's getting cold," she said, nodding toward the forgotten tray. "I don't care about dinner right now." His arm slipped around her waist, drawing her closer. "I care about this moment right here. This time when he kissed her, there was nothing tentative about it. His lips claimed hers with a certainty that made Grace's knees weak, and she found herself clinging to his good shoulder for support as she returned the kiss with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Grace Lawson," he whispered, "and that scares me more than any bullet." "Why does it scare you?" she asked, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. "Because I've lost everyone I ever loved, and the thought of losing you." He closed his eyes briefly. "I couldn't bear it." Grace touched his face, turning it so he had to look at her. "You're not going to lose me. I'm right here, and I think I'm falling in love with you too." The admission, spoken aloud for the first time, seemed to hang in the air between them, fragile and precious. Then Garrett smiled, a smile so full of joy it transformed his entire face. "Well," he said softly, "I guess taking that bullet was the smartest thing I ever did then." Grace laughed again, but there were tears in her eyes. "Don't you ever do it again, though. One bullet hole in you is quite enough, thank you very much." His expression grew serious. "I'd take 100 bullets for you, Grace. But I'd rather spend a lifetime keeping you safe from ever needing such a sacrifice again." The words sounded like a promise, like a future. And as Grace raised herself on tiptoe to kiss him once more, she felt as though that future was unfolding before them, bright with possibility. The following morning, Grace found herself humming as she worked in the store, her happiness evident to everyone who came in. Her father watched her with a knowing smile but said nothing about the change in her demeanor. It wasn't until they closed for lunch that George Lawson finally broached the subject. "Our patient seems to be recovering well," he remarked as they sat down to eat. "Yes, Dr. Matthews says the wound is healing cleanly," Grace replied, trying to keep her voice neutral. "MMM." Her father buttered a piece of bread, his eyes twinkling. "And how are things otherwise between you and Mr. Lockhart?" Grace felt her cheeks grow warm. "I don't know what you mean." "Grace, I'm your father. I've known you your entire life. You've been walking around with your head in the clouds all morning." He set down his knife. "And I saw the way you looked at him when you brought his breakfast up earlier." For a moment, Grace considered denying it, but then she sighed. "Is it that obvious? Only to someone who knows you well." Her father reached across the table to pat her hand. "He's a good man, Grace. I've had enough conversations with him these past weeks to be sure of that." Relief washed through her. "So, you wouldn't object if Garrett and I were to court properly?" Her father finished for her. "No, I wouldn't object, though I would expect him to ask my permission like a gentleman." Grace smiled, grateful for her father's understanding. "He would. He's very traditional that way. Good." George Lawson took a bite of his bread, chewed thoughtfully, then added, "He'll need a proper job, though. Can't court my daughter while living under my roof and eating my food." "He's planning to return to the Blackwell Ranch as soon as he's able," Grace assured him. "Mr. Blackwell has promised to hold his position." Her father nodded approvingly. "Blackwell's a fair employer, and his ranch is close enough that Garrett could ride into town regularly." He gave Grace a meaningful look, for proper, chaperoned visits. Grace laughed, her heart light with happiness. "Of course, Papa. We wouldn't dream of impropriety." That evening, with her father's tacit blessing, Grace and Garrett sat on the small porch behind the store, watching the fireflies appear in the gathering dusk. Garrett's good arm was around her shoulders, holding her close against the cooling evening air. "I spoke with your father today," Garrett said after a comfortable silence. Grace looked up at him. "Oh, what about?" "About courting his daughter properly." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "He said he'd allow it, but only if I promised to be gainfully employed and able to provide for you someday." Joy bubbled up inside Grace. "And what did you say to that?" I said that providing for you, making you happy, would be the greatest privilege of my life." Garrett turned to face her fully, his expression earnest. "I meant it, Grace. I don't have much now, but I'm a hard worker. And that land I've been saving for, it's not just a dream anymore. It's a plan for our future, if you want that too." "Our future," Grace repeated softly, the words filling her with warmth. "Yes, I want that too, very much." Garrett's smile was radiant in the fading light. He leaned forward to kiss her gently, a promise sealed between them. Over the next month, as Garrett continued to recover and gradually regained strength in his injured arm, their relationship deepened. They spent evenings talking about their hopes and dreams, about the ranch they would build together someday, about the family they hoped to have. When Garrett finally returned to the Blackwell Ranch 6 weeks after the shooting, it was with mixed emotions. He was eager to be working again, to be earning his keep and adding to his savings, but reluctant to be apart from Grace, even though the ranch was only a half-day's ride from town. "I'll come into Fort Smith every Sunday," he promised as they said goodbye at the edge of town. "And whenever else Mr. Blackwell can spare me." "I'll count the days," Grace replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. Garrett brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch lingering on her cheek. "This isn't goodbye, Grace. It's just the beginning of our story." And so began their courtship in earnest, a series of Sunday visits, chaperoned walks through town, shared meals with her father, and the occasional stolen moment alone where they could exchange kisses and whispered promises of the future. News of their courtship spread quickly through Fort Smith, but the town's reaction was largely positive. The romantic story of the cowboy who took a bullet to save the storekeeper's daughter, only to win her heart during his recovery, captured the imagination of even the most hardened cynics. As summer faded into fall, Garrett's arm had healed enough that he could perform most of his regular duties at the ranch, though he still experienced occasional pain and stiffness, especially in cold or damp weather. But he never complained, never spoke of regret for the split-second decision that had forever changed the course of his life. "Some things are worth the pain," he told Grace when she fretted over his discomfort one chilly October evening. "And you, Grace Lawson, are worth everything." By Christmas, Garrett had saved enough money to make an offer on a small piece of land about 5 miles outside of Fort Smith, 160 acres of good grazing land, with a creek running through it, and a small, somewhat dilapidated cabin that could be fixed up with work. "It's not much," he said apologetically as he showed the property to Grace and her father on a crisp December day. "But the soil's good. There's plenty of water, and with some work, that cabin could be a proper home." "It's perfect," Grace declared, turning in a circle to take in the rolling land that stretched to a line of trees in the distance. "I can already see it, the house expanded there, a barn over there, a garden behind the house." George Lawson watched his daughter with a fond smile, then clapped Garrett on the shoulder. "You've done well, son. It's a fine piece of land with good prospects." Garrett's face lit up at the older man's approval. "Thank you, sir. I plan to start fixing up the cabin right away, so it will be ready by spring." Grace looked at him questioningly. "Ready for what?" Garrett glanced at her father, who nodded almost imperceptibly, then turned back to Grace. Slowly, he lowered himself to one knee, wincing slightly as his still healing shoulder protested the movement. "Ready for us," he said, taking her hand in his. "Grace Lawson, these past months have been the happiest of my life. You've shown me what it means to have a home, not just a place to lay my head, but a place where I belong." He took a deep breath. "I love you more than I ever thought possible, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Tears of joy spilled down Grace's cheeks as she nodded vigorously. Yes, yes, Garrett, I'll marry you. He rose to his feet and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that made her father clear his throat loudly after a few moments. I think that's settled then, George Lawson said dryly. Now, Garrett, let's discuss the practical matters of getting this place ready for my daughter. Throughout the winter months, Garrett split his time between his duties at the Blackwell Ranch and working on the cabin. Several of his fellow cowboys volunteered their help, grateful to assist the man who had become a friend to many of them. Even George Lawson rolled up his sleeves on Sundays to help with the renovation, his skills as a carpenter proving invaluable. By March, the cabin had been transformed. The roof was repaired, the walls reinforced and chinked against the cold, the single room expanded to include a proper bedroom, and a new cook stove installed. It was still modest, but it was solid and warm, a place where a young couple could begin their life together. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in April, when the worst of winter had passed, but before the busy season at the Blackwell Ranch began in earnest. The entire town of Fort Smith turned out for the occasion, the small church filled to overflowing with friends and well-wishers. Grace wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had once adorned her mother's wedding gown. Garrett, looking both nervous and proud, wore a new suit purchased specifically for the occasion, his usually unruly dark hair slicked down and his face freshly shaven. "Never seen you looking so respectable, Lockhart," one of his cowboy friends teased before the ceremony. "Almost didn't recognize you without the dust and cow smell." Garrett laughed good-naturedly, but his attention was focused on the church door, waiting for his first glimpse of his bride. When Grace appeared on her father's arm, a hush fell over the assembled guests. Garrett felt his breath catch in his throat at the sight of her, radiant with happiness, her eyes seeking his as she moved slowly down the aisle toward him. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, the couple exchanging vows they had written themselves. Garrett's voice was steady as he promised to cherish and protect Grace for all the days of his life. Grace's words were clear and strong as she pledged her love and faith to the man who had risked everything to save her. "By the power vested in me," the minister concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." The kiss they shared was tender and reverent, a promise of the life they would build together. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors, now introduced as Mr. and Mrs. Garrett Lockhart, the church erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration afterward was held in the town square, with tables laden with food contributed by nearly every household in Fort Smith. There was music and dancing, laughter and a few sentimental tears as the community celebrated not just a wedding, but a love story that had begun with an act of heroism and blossomed through adversity. As the sun began to set, Garrett took Grace's hand and led her to a waiting wagon decorated with ribbons and flowers. "Ready to see our home, Mrs. Lockhart?" he asked, his eyes shining with love. "More than ready, Mr. Lockhart," she replied, squeezing his hand. They said their goodbyes amid good-natured teasing and well wishes, then set off toward their new home as husband and wife, the future stretching before them like the open road. The first year of marriage brought both joys and challenges. The small ranch Garrett had purchased required constant work, fences to be mended, fields to be cleared, cattle to be tended. Grace learned to balance her duties as a housewife with helping Garrett on the ranch, often working alongside him from dawn till dusk. But there were sweet moments, 2 quiet evenings on the porch watching the sunset, shared meals at their small table, nights wrapped in each other's arms as the wind howled outside their snug cabin. By their first anniversary, they had increased their small herd of cattle from 10 to 25 head. added a sturdy barn to the property, and expanded the garden behind the house to provide most of their vegetables. They weren't wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable and, more importantly, happy. It was on that anniversary that Grace shared news that would change their lives once more. "I have a gift for you," she told Garrett as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the first stars appear in the April sky. "You didn't need to get me anything," he protested. "Having you as my wife is gift enough." Grace smiled mysteriously and placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "It's not something I bought," she said softly. "It's something we made together." Garrett stared at her for a moment, uncomprehending, then his eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Are you saying, are we going to have a baby?" Grace nodded, her eyes shining with happy tears. "Dr. Matthews confirmed it yesterday. By Christmas, we'll be a family of 3. With a whoop of joy, Garrett lifted her from her chair and spun her around, his injured shoulder long since healed enough for such exuberance. "A baby, our baby," he set her down gently, his expression suddenly concerned. "Are you feeling all right? Should you be resting more? Do you need anything?" Grace laughed at his sudden barrage of questions. "I'm perfectly fine. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, you know. Not my wife, not carrying my child." Garrett knelt before her, pressing a gentle kiss to her stomach through her dress. "Hello in there, little one. Your pa can't wait to meet you." The tenderness of the gesture brought fresh tears to Grace's eyes. In that moment, she felt that her heart might burst with love for this man who had once taken a bullet meant for her, and now looked at their unborn child with such wonder and devotion. As her pregnancy progressed through the summer and fall, Garrett grew increasingly protective, insisting on hiring a young ranch hand to help with the heavier work so Grace could rest more. Her father visited often, bringing supplies from the store and staying to help with projects around the ranch. "Never seen a man so anxious about a baby coming," George Lawson remarked with amusement after witnessing Garrett rearrange the furniture in the small nursery for the 3rd time in a week. "He's been like this since I told him," Grace confided, her hand resting on her now prominent belly. "You'd think no one had ever had a baby before." Her father smiled fondly. "Your mother was the same way when she was expecting you. Read every book she could find, had me building a cradle months before you were due." His eyes grew distant with the memory. "She would have loved seeing you like this, happy, expecting a child of your own." "I think about her often these days," Grace admitted, "wondering what advice she would give me, what stories she would tell." "She would tell you that you're going to be a wonderful mother," George said confidently. "And she would be right." On a cold December night, just a week before Christmas, Grace's labor began. Garrett rode frantically into town to fetch Dr. Matthews, returning with the doctor and her father in tow, just as the contractions were beginning to intensify. "You men wait outside," the doctor ordered, shooing Garrett and George from the bedroom. "This is women's business now." A neighbor woman who had assisted with many births over the years had already arrived to help, and she nodded approvingly as the men retreated to the main room of the cabin. For hours, Garrett paced the floor, flinching at every cry of pain from the bedroom. "This is torture," he muttered to his father-in-law. "How do men stand it?" "By remembering that women are stronger than we could ever be," George replied sagely. "And by having faith that God knows what he's doing." Just after dawn, a new cry pierced the air, the lusty wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Garrett froze in mid-pace, his heart hammering in his chest as he stared at the bedroom door when Dr. Matthews finally emerged, his tired face split into a wide smile. "Congratulations, Mr. Lockhart, you have a healthy son, a son." Garrett felt his knees go weak with relief and joy. "And Grace, is she all right?" "Tired but well," the doctor assured him. She's asking for you." Garrett needed no further invitation. He hurried into the bedroom where Grace lay propped against pillows, her face pale but radiant as she cradled a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Come meet your son," she said softly as Garrett approached the bed. With trembling hands, he accepted the tiny bundle, peering down at the red, wrinkled face of his child. The baby yawned, his tiny fist escaping the blanket, and Garrett felt his heart expand with a love so fierce it took his breath away. "He's perfect," he whispered, perching carefully on the edge of the bed beside Grace. "Just like his mother." Grace leaned against his shoulder, exhausted but happy. "What shall we name him?" They had discussed names throughout her pregnancy, but had never settled on a final choice. Now, looking down at his son's face, Garrett knew. "James George Lockhart," he said. "For my brother and your father." Grace smiled, her eyes filled with tears of joy. "It's perfect." As the first light of day filtered through the bedroom window, illuminating the small family huddled together on the bed, Garrett thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a gunshot on a dusty street to this quiet dawn with his wife and newborn son, it had been a path he could never have imagined, yet one he would choose again without hesitation. "I love you," he whispered to Grace, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Both of you more than I can say." Grace reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with infinite tenderness. "And we love you, Garrett Lockhart, our protector, our provider, our heart." In the years that followed, the Lockhart ranch prospered. With hard work and careful management, Garrett was able to expand their holdings, eventually building a larger house to accommodate their growing family. James was joined by a sister, Sarah Elizabeth, 2 years later, and another brother, Thomas, 2 years after that. Grace never forgot those 3 nights she had spent at Garrett's bedside, watching over him as he fought for his life after taking a bullet meant for her. In a way, their entire life together had grown from those hours, their love taking root in a time of crisis, blossoming through his recovery, and bearing fruit in the family and home they had built together. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, and they sat together on the porch of their home, watching the stars appear over their land, Garrett would touch the scar on his shoulder thoughtfully. "Best bullet I ever took," he would say, smiling at Grace with the same love that had sustained them through all their years together. And Grace would lean her head against his shoulder, marveling at the twist of fate that had brought them together, a single moment of heroism that had changed the course of both their lives forever. "I think," she would reply, entwining her fingers with his, "that some loves are simply meant to be bullet or no bullet." But in her heart, she was grateful for that fateful day in Fort Smith, for the cowboy who had risked everything to save a woman he barely knew, and for the 3 nights she had stayed awake loving him through his darkest hours, the beginning of a love that would last a lifetime.